All right, and welcome to Words of the Master Part 2. We were talking about in our last video three ways of understanding. Three ways of understanding genuine servitude. Three ways of understanding genuine servitude. And we said, in those three ways, we gave you three ways. We said, one, by becoming egoless. That means losing your ego altogether. Two, by becoming last of all. And three, becoming servant of all. All three of these things are very hard to do. Well, our ego drives our desire to be first. And usually, the last thing we want to be is last. And then there's servant of all. No one wants to serve particularly everyone. But that's what the scripture says. We started off by talking about our scripture when we said here that the scripture comes from the book of Mark, the 9th chapter, 33 through 58. I refer you to that and encourage you, please read it as you track with these lessons. Our particular focus is on verse 9, or should I say chapter 9 and verse 35. Chapter 9, verse 35. We have already told you that the ego is very difficult to get rid of. We tried to tell you that the first thing that makes it a hard problem is that it's hard to fight the ego. If you fight it, you almost invariably lose. And when you go to battle with the ego, get ready, because it's going to try to sustain itself. The ego is very subtle. Its ways are subtle. Its workings is very complex. It's a puzzle, and a puzzle that cannot be solved. That's the ego. A puzzle that cannot be solved, that can only be seen through and through but cannot be solved. There is no solution for it, because the puzzle is not anything accidental to the ego. The ego is the puzzle. And then we talked about trying to repress the ego. And we've said, can you repress it? The answer is no. People have done that too. It has not helped. If you repress the ego, it goes deeper into your being. Rather than getting rid of it, you become more and more poisoned by it. So you try to repress it. And then third, you can't sublimate it. That's the third thing that have been tried throughout the ages. Sublimation. Sublimate it, let it be identified with higher goals, and it grows more. Then it becomes decorated, it becomes enthroned, and naturally it again becomes very powerful. It begins to identify, if you identify it with the church, identify it with your country, identify it with your color, identify it with ideology, socialism, communism, fascism, or Christianity or Hinduism. Identify it with some high value, some utopian value, or you can identify it with God. Then it rules supermost. Then it rules in the name of God. God is just an excuse. The real sovereign becomes, once again, the ego. The ego reigns supreme. And so we're saying that the ego will keep growing more and more. And nothing can be more, no one is more egotistical than people. No one is more egotistical than religious people. Religious people are the most ego-driven. They pretend that they're egoless and humble, but you know it is not, absolutely not true. The so-called religious person is deceived by the ego because it comes hiding behind religious curtains. Sometimes it becomes humbleness. Sometimes it becomes humility. Sometimes it can pretend egolessness. It can say, I am absolutely egoless. And it is there, and now it has protected itself perfectly in the name of God. You will not even suspect its existence. You watch the so-called religious people, and you will see a great game of the ego. Watch them. You watch religious people, it's a great game of the ego. There's no real remedy to the ego. And if you want to really serve, you got to get rid of it. But it's an inside job, not a job that's external to us. It's a job that's internal. Our behavior is not who we are. My behavior is not really me. And so the challenge of the ego, getting rid of the ego, is one of the biggest challenges that we experience. Another thing about the ego is it stays inside of us. As you can see in our preset, the ego has to be controlled by prayer and meditation. Prayer is mostly thoughts directed at self. Prayer should be an outflow of joy and love, and inside of us, prayer is the state. It's not a ritual. It's a state of being. It's not a ritual. It's a state of inner silence, humbleness. It's a state, not a ritual, a state of inner silence, humbleness, love, and gratitude. But more importantly, it's a state of surrender. And here's where we get the biggest benefit from looking at our ego and looking at the way of getting rid of it. The most important thing you have to do, let's put our eye here, is to be able to watch the ego. And if you can watch the ego, you can see how it controls almost everything around it. Just looking at it allows you to let it go. Outside remedies versus inside silence. Ego splits into 3 cells, and by splitting, it allows it'll start dissipating when you start watching it grow. The ego is a big problem in every seeker. Every seeker runs into the problem of ego. So the first thing to be understood is the ego is the basic problem that anyone who is searching for the real self has to face. The biggest problem that they have to face. Now, it cannot be countered by anything outside. No remedy is going to help. No medicine is going to help. No method is going to help. Then, is there any way to get rid of it? There's a way. But it cannot be imposed from the outside. And the way is not like a remedy. The way is clarity. C-L-A-R-I-T-Y. Or what I call transparency. Transparency. P-A-R-E-N-C-Y. Transparency. The ego has to be looked at through and through. We have to watch it function. Transparency. We have to watch the ego function. And that's the way to get rid of it. As you watch, you throw it out from the front door, and of course it comes in from the back door. You throw it out from the side, it starts imposing itself from another side. You think you've gotten rid of it, and suddenly you find that they're sitting inside. So, without any condemnation, the ego has to be looked into through and through, with no idea that you want to drop it. That conclusion would be a hindrance. That conclusion means you've decided before you have even looked at it. So you have to go into the ego with no conclusion, with no idea what you want to do, with just one idea: to watch. Watching it equals decrease. It decreases as you watch. It gets smaller. It starts off huge, then it gets smaller and smaller. It's big in the beginning, but as you watch it, it gets smaller and smaller. Because the ego is nothing but past and future projections. Past and future projections. And once you move past thinking about the past or the future, you can then be able to see the ego starts getting smaller and smaller. And if you keep watching, it decreases. Because the past has not happened and the future has not come. It's only a projection. The ego cannot exist without a focus on the past or the future. We're going to take another look in our next video. We're going to look at what happens when we repress the ego. What happens? We know what happens when you fight it. You lose. But when you repress it, what happens? When you sublimate it, what happens? The same energy that goes into making it bigger happens. So that gives us an opportunity now to talk about how the ego can become less, and how by becoming last of all, we're able to understand how to become servant of all. More in the next video.